The sea at night smells different from the sea in daylight. In the darkness, the salt is heavier, almost medicinal, and the sound of the water against the hull is not the bright slapping noise of afternoon voyages, but something lower, more continuous. Like breathing, Elissa stood at the stern of her ship, somewhere in the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, and she watched the last orange smear of Tyre disappear behind the horizon. She did not know yet what she was building. She only knew what she was escaping. Her brother Pygmalion had murdered her husband Asabas to seize his wealth. And the choice before her had been simple in the way that only the most terrible choices are simple. Stay and be consumed by a court built on blood, or gather whoever would follow and sail west into the dark. She chose the dark, and in choosing it, she chose something that would outlast empires. The ancient sources call her Elissa. The Romans, who came later and needed her story for their own purposes, called her Dido. She sailed with a group of Phoenician nobles and their households, carrying whatever gods and portable wealth they could load onto ships before dawn, made them visible to Pygmalion's soldiers. The Phoenician people, the seafaring civilization of the Levantine coast, whose great cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos had dominated Mediterranean commerce since roughly 1200 years before the Common Era, were not strangers to this kind of movement. They had been planting trading outposts across the Mediterranean for generations, following the routes of tin and silver and purple, dye into waters that other civilizations considered the edge of the known world. What Elissa did was not unusual for a Phoenician. What was unusual was where she stopped. She sailed to the coast of North Africa, to a peninsula jutting into what we now call the Gulf of Tunis, and there she encountered a Berber king named Iarbas. She asked him for land. He, presumably amused by this foreign woman arriving on his shore with a handful of ships and an air of complete certainty, agreed to give her as much land as an ox hide could cover. Elissa took the ox hide and cut it into the thinnest strips she could manage, laid them end to end in an enormous circle, and enclosed enough ground to build a citadel. The place took its name from the hide, Bursa, the Greek word. The city that grew from it she called Carthage, the new city. We know it as Carthage. The trick with the ox hide is almost certainly legend rather than literal history. But legends do not survive for centuries by being irrelevant. This one survives because it captures, in a single image, the defining quality of the civilization that Elissa founded: the ability to see possibility inside a constraint, to take what someone else considers a limitation and transform it into an advantage through patience, precision, and an intelligence that never announces itself. Modern archaeology places the actual founding of Carthage at approximately 814 years before the Common Era, a date that corresponds reasonably well with the traditional chronology preserved in the ancient sources. The site chosen was not accidental and not merely convenient. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most strategically gifted pieces of geography in the entire Mediterranean world. The peninsula controlled the narrowest passage in the central Mediterranean, the strait between the Tunisian coast and the Sicilian shore that any vessel crossing between the eastern and western halves of the sea had to navigate. Whoever held Carthage held the throat of the Mediterranean. Whoever held the throat of the Mediterranean held the commercial pulse of the ancient world. The Phoenician founders understood this with the clarity that comes from generations of watching where the trade winds go and where the silver moves. They were not building a home, they were building a machine designed to accumulate advantage through geography, through commerce, through the quiet and relentless logic of a people who had learned that you do not need an army. If you control the road, everyone else must travel. The city that grew on that peninsula drew from everything around it: the Phoenician script, the first purely alphabetic writing system in human history. The ancestor of the Greek and Latin alphabets, and therefore of almost every writing system in the modern Western world, was the medium of Carthaginian literacy. The Phoenician religious tradition, with its great sky god Baal-Hamon and its sophisticated temple culture, was the foundation of Carthaginian religious life. But Carthage was never simply a Phoenician colony transplanted to African soil. The Berber populations of the Tunisian hinterland were not displaced or erased. Their farmers supplied the agricultural surpluses that fed the growing city. Their cavalry, already among the finest in the known world, would eventually serve in Carthaginian armies. Their elites intermarried with Carthaginian noble families across the cultural boundary. Something new was being made here. At the intersection of Semitic and African and eventually Greek and Egyptian influences, something that borrowed from all its sources and was reducible to none of them. When historians call Carthaginian civilization a hybrid, they sometimes mean it as a diminishment, as if borrowing from multiple traditions makes a culture less serious. What they should mean is that Carthage was doing what every genuinely original civilization does, taking what the world offered and making it into something the world had not seen before. Elisa, standing on that North African shore with her cut ox hide and her circle of new ground and her determination to build rather than mourn, was not the end of a Phoenician story. She was the beginning of an African one. The fires of Tyre were behind her. Ahead, in the warm dark above the Gulf of Tunis, the stars hung low and steady, the way they do over water when the wind has gone quiet and the night is holding its breath before something begins. She had no army. She had no treaty with any great power. She had no guarantee that the land she had enclosed with an ox hide would not simply be taken back the moment Iarbas changed his mind. What she had was the conviction, bred into her by a civilization that had been sailing toward the unknown for centuries, that the world is not closed to those who read it carefully. Carthage was founded on that conviction, and for nearly 700 years. It would prove her right. Stand at the edge of the Bursa Hill on a clear morning, sometime in the 4th century before the Common Era, and the city below you would have taken your breath in the way that only a few places on Earth ever do. Not because of a single monument or a single view, but because of sheer accumulated human density, the sense of a civilization running at full pressure in every direction at once. The streets descend from the citadel in a grid of remarkable regularity. Straight lines and consistent blocks of a kind that speaks not of organic growth, but of deliberate planning. Of a people who thought about cities the way they thought about harbors and trade routes, as problems to be solved with intelligence, rather than allowed to solve themselves with time. The buildings rose several stories in some quarters, their flat rooftops catching the Mediterranean light, their lower floors opening onto streets that smelled of fish sauce and cedar timber and the particular mineral sharpness of fresh-cut stone. Somewhere below, always, the sound of the harbour, ropes under tension, timber groaning, the calls of men managing cargo in a dozen languages, because Carthage at its height was a city of perhaps 700,000 people, larger than Rome itself for much of the period of their great rivalry. And the commerce that sustained all of those lives arrived and departed by sea. The physical infrastructure of the city was, by any honest assessment, extraordinary. The walls that enclosed Carthage on its landward side were not simply defensive barriers, but self-contained military installations. Ancient accounts describe a triple wall, 3 parallel structures, each roughly 10 meters high, the outermost massive enough to contain within its own thickness the stables for 300 war elephants and 4,000 cavalry horses, along with the barracks to house the soldiers who managed them. The artificial harbour complex, known as the Cothon, 2 interconnected basins, a rectangular outer harbour for merchant vessels, and a circular inner harbour for the war fleet, was the most sophisticated piece of naval engineering in the ancient Western Mediterranean. The circular military harbour was approximately 325 metres across, ringed with covered ship sheds, capable of housing more than 200 warships simultaneously. Their roofs supported by columns that also served as a visual screen, preventing observers outside from counting the fleet within. At the centre of the circular basin rose an island from which the admiral could observe every berth and direct operations with a single line of sight to every corner of the harbour. Beneath the city, cisterns cut deep into the rock could store enough fresh water to sustain the population through extended sieges. Underground drainage channels carried waste to the sea, giving Carthage a public health infrastructure more sophisticated than almost any contemporary city in the Mediterranean world. The agricultural theorist, Mago of Carthage, wrote a 28-volume treatise on farming practices so admired by the Romans that when they burned everything else, they specifically preserved it and had it translated into Latin. His work covered soil management, crop rotation, viticulture, and the systematic administration of agricultural estates, with an attention to efficiency that made the Tunisian coastal plain one of the most productive agricultural regions in the ancient world. A civilization that builds harbours like engineering diagrams and writes agricultural science in 28 volumes is not a civilization that history should have allowed to be remembered, primarily through the words of the people who destroyed it. What the harbour districts of Carthage actually felt like at the working level is something worth slowing down to feel. The warehouses that lined the commercial quays held goods from the length and breadth of the known world and beyond it. Tin from Britain, reached by Carthaginian navigators sailing north along the Atlantic coast of Europe in voyages that ancient sources attribute to an explorer named Himilco, arriving in waters that the Mediterranean world barely knew existed. Gold and ivory from West Africa, brought back by expeditions sailing south along the African coast, including the voyage attributed to Hanno, the navigator, who sailed far enough south to observe what his account describes as hairy men whose skins were preserved as curiosities. Almost certainly gorillas, seen by Mediterranean eyes for the first time. Silver from the mines of southern Spain, the mineral wealth that would later finance Hannibal's war against Rome, and that was already centuries before that conflict, the financial foundation of Carthaginian commercial dominance. And Tyrian purple, the dye extracted from murex sea snails through a process of extraordinary labour intensity. Thousands of snails for a small quantity of dye. The snail glands left to putrefy in sunlight before processing. The smell notoriously foul and the resulting colour notoriously permanent, surviving centuries of washing without fading, ranging from deep scarlet through crimson to the rich purple that became synonymous across the entire ancient Mediterranean with wealth, royalty, and power. Carthaginian control of the dyeing industry along the North African coast gave the city a near monopoly on this prestige commodity, and the profits it generated flowed back into the harbour districts in a continuous cycle of commercial accumulation that sustained everything else the city was and did. The Greek historian Herodotus describes one Carthaginian commercial practice that has stayed in the historical imagination for 2.5 millennia, the silent trade with West African peoples, conducted without shared language, through a patient system of reciprocal offering on a beach. Goods laid out, parties withdrawing, signals exchanged, adjustments made, until both sides were satisfied. Herodotus adds that the Carthaginians never cheated in this process, understanding that their reputation was worth more than any single transaction. That observation, preserved in a Greek text written by someone who was not particularly a friend to Carthage, captures something essential about the civilization, a people who built their world on the understanding that trust, carefully maintained across cultural difference and geographic distance, was the most valuable commercial asset of all. The city that held all of this, the harbours and the cisterns and the triple walls and the purple dye and the silent trade and the 700,000 lives, sat on its peninsula above the Gulf of Tunis in the Mediterranean afternoon, entirely itself, unlike anything the world had made before. The commercial treaties that Carthage negotiated with Rome in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, some of the oldest diplomatic documents preserved in Latin, explicitly reserved the Western Mediterranean as a Carthaginian commercial zone, restricting Roman ships from trading in those waters without Carthaginian permission. Rome signed those treaties for 2 centuries. Rome obeyed them. The world that Carthage had built was real enough that even the city that would eventually destroy it once agreed. In writing, to stay out of its way, there is a place outside the old walls of Carthage where the ground holds something that archaeologists have been trying to understand for over a century, and that historians have been arguing about for longer than that. It is called the Tophet, a word borrowed from the Hebrew scriptures. And what excavations have revealed there is this: thousands of small burial urns, carefully placed, each containing the cremated remains of an infant or a very young child, each marked with an inscribed stone stele bearing dedications to the 2 greatest deities of the Carthaginian religious world. The urns are real. The remains are real. The dedications are real. What is not settled, what may never be fully settled, is what they mean. The ancient Greek and Roman sources are unambiguous in their interpretation. They describe Carthaginian child sacrifice as a regular institutional practice. The deliberate killing of children, specifically firstborn children of noble families, offered to the sky god Baal-Hamon in moments of civic crisis or as the fulfillment of religious vows. These accounts were written by people who were, at various points in history, at war with Carthage, competing with Carthage commercially, or writing in a cultural tradition that had absorbed generations of Roman propaganda about the monstrous nature of Rome's greatest enemy. That context does not automatically make them wrong, but it makes them insufficient as the sole basis for a verdict. Modern scholars have examined the skeletal evidence from the Tophet with the tools that ancient writers did not possess, and what they have found is genuinely ambiguous in ways that the Roman sources are not. Many of the infant remains date from the perinatal period, the weeks immediately before and after birth, a phase of life carrying extremely high mortality rates in the ancient world, even under the best circumstances. Some researchers have argued that the Tophet was primarily a cemetery for infants who died naturally, given a consecrated burial in a sacred precinct because they had died before the normal rites of childhood incorporation could be performed, before they had been formally named and welcomed into the community of the living. Under this interpretation, the inscriptions dedicating the burials to Baal, Hamon and Tanit reflect not the circumstances of the children's deaths, but the religious framework within which their deaths were understood and mourned. The same impulse that leads grieving parents in many cultures to place their lost children in the care of the divine. Other scholars find this interpretation insufficient. They point to the presence of animal remains mixed with the infant urns in certain layers, animals being a recognized substitute sacrifice in many ancient religious traditions, and argue that the pattern of deposits is more consistent with votive offering than with natural death burial. They point to the consistency of the ancient testimony across multiple independent sources, Greek and Roman and others, and argue that the convergence of hostile witnesses reporting the same practice independently carries evidential weight that cannot be entirely dissolved by pointing to their motivations. The honest position, the position that the evidence actually supports, is that we do not know with certainty what happened in the Tophet, and that anyone who tells you otherwise is reading the evidence through a lens they have not fully disclosed. What we can say with confidence is this: the religious world of Carthage was richer, more sophisticated, and more internally complex than the Roman caricature allows. Baal Hammon, the lord of the altar of incense, was a sky deity associated with the sun and with storms, the supreme male divinity of the Phoenician religious inheritance that Carthage carried from its founding. But it was Tanit who became, over the centuries of Carthaginian civilization, the most pervasive and most beloved figure in the religious imagination of the city. Hair symbol, a triangular body with raised arms, a horizontal bar, and a disc atop it, suggesting the moon, appears on monumental stone stelae and on humble household objects, on coins and on tomb walls, and on the decorated faces of everyday pottery. She was associated with the moon, with fertility, with the protection of the city and its people. Her presence in Carthaginian material culture is so ubiquitous that it communicates something beyond formal religious obligation. It suggests a genuine personal relationship between ordinary Carthaginians and a goddess they experienced as near and as caring. The temple traditions of Carthage were continuous with the Phoenician religious architecture from which they descended. Elaborate and well-maintained structures that required significant communal resources to sustain, reflecting a religious life that was taken seriously at every level of society. The religious art of Carthage, the carved stelae, the terracotta figurines, the imagery on seals and coins, shows the same hybrid cultural intelligence that characterized every other dimension of Carthaginian civilization. Absorbing Egyptian iconography and Greek artistic conventions and indigenous Berber religious elements into a visual language that was recognizably its own. Sacred scarab amulets of Egyptian origin appear throughout Carthaginian archaeological contexts across the Mediterranean. Greek mythological figures were incorporated into Carthaginian religious understanding, in the same spirit of open cultural exchange that characterized Phoenician engagement with the world. What this religious culture was not, in any dimension, the evidence actually supports, was the rigid and fanatical system of institutionalized horror that Roman writers described for Roman audiences, who needed to believe that what Rome did to Carthage was justified. The thousands of small urns in the Tophet precinct hold children whose lives were short, whether they were taken or simply lost. The stone markers placed above them represent an act of commemoration, a refusal to let those small lives pass without acknowledgement. That much, at least, is something we can read in the earth without argument. In the end, perhaps what the Tophet tells us most clearly is not what the Carthaginians did to their children, but how much they felt the weight of losing them. The religion of Carthage, like the city itself, was a living thing, absorbing, adapting, accumulating meaning across 7 centuries of contact with the world. To judge it entirely through the testimony of those who burned its temples is to make the same error that Rome wanted history to make, to let the destroyers write the only story that survives. Aristotle did not hand out praise carelessly. The philosopher who systematically analyzed the constitutions of 158 Greek and non-Greek states in the 4th century before the Common Era, who developed the theoretical vocabulary through which the Western world has understood political organization for 2.5 millennia, who was capable of finding fault with Sparta and Athens, and virtually every other political system he examined. That Aristotle, in his Politics, placed Carthage alongside Sparta and Crete as among the best governed states in the known world. He praised its constitutional stability. He noted, with the particular admiration of a man who had watched Greek city after Greek city tear itself apart through factional violence. That Carthage had managed to avoid both tyranny and popular uprising across the full span of its history. He attributed this stability to the balance of power between its elected magistrates, its council of senior citizens, and its popular assembly, combined with a commercial prosperity that gave the citizen population a material stake in the maintenance of the existing order. His criticism that wealth played too large a role in determining access to office, that rich men could effectively purchase political influence, was offered in the context of an overall judgment that remained deeply respectful. Aristotle was not writing propaganda. He had no stake in making Carthage look good. He was doing what he always did, looking at a political system with the cold clarity of a man trying to understand how human communities actually organize themselves. And what he saw in Carthage impressed him. This fact has been insufficiently absorbed by the historical tradition that came after him, a tradition shaped at its foundations by Rome, which needed Carthage to be barbaric in order for its destruction to be defensible. The constitutional machinery of the Carthaginian Republic was genuinely sophisticated in ways that bear examining slowly, because its sophistication is part of what makes its erasure from historical memory so strange. The two chief magistrates of the state were called suffets, a title derived from a Semitic root meaning judges, and they functioned in a manner broadly comparable to the Roman consuls, elected annually, serving as the executive heads of state, presiding over legal proceedings, representing Carthage in diplomatic negotiations, and commanding military forces in emergencies, like the Roman consuls. The suffets operated within explicit constitutional constraints that prevented the conversion of executive authority into personal rule. The annual election that determined their successors ensured that no suffet could entrench himself in power long enough to become a tyrant. Above them, or alongside them in a system of distributed authority that resists simple hierarchical description, sat the Council of Elders, the Carthaginian equivalent of the Roman Senate, a body of wealthy and experienced citizens whose collective judgment carried the weight of both institutional authority and personal prestige, accumulated over careers of commercial and civic achievement. The council held approval authority over major decisions of state, treaties, declarations of war, the appointment of military commanders. Its deliberations provided the continuity and collective memory that annual elected magistrates, by definition, could not provide alone. And then there was the Board of 104, the body that had authority to investigate and prosecute Carthaginian officials, including military commanders, for misconduct or failure in office. This institution, which could try and condemn unsuccessful generals with a severity that the ancient sources describe as genuinely fearsome, was one of the most distinctive features of the entire Carthaginian constitutional architecture. The tension it created between the military boldness that successful campaigning required and the institutional accountability that the board enforced was a recurring pressure in Carthaginian political and military life. And it shaped the decisions of commanders in ways that Rome's generals, answerable primarily to their own ambitions and the shifting moods of the popular assembly, were not shaped. The great noble families of Carthage operated within this constitutional framework, with the fluid combination of formal participation and informal influence that characterizes oligarchic republics in every era. Wealth was the primary currency of political power, and the accumulated commercial wealth of the leading families gave them a gravitational pull on the institutions of the state that no constitutional arrangement could entirely neutralize. The Maganid family dominated Carthaginian political and military life in the earlier centuries of the Republic's history. providing a succession of generals and civic leaders whose combined influence shaped the city's expansion across the Western Mediterranean. But it is the Barcid family, arriving at the center of Carthaginian history in the crisis years following the First Punic War, that history has remembered above all others. Their name came from the Semitic word for lightning, barak, and the name was earned, Hamilcar Barca. The patriarch of the family's military dynasty was the general who held the Carthaginian position in Sicily against Roman pressure for years without being defeated in the field, who was forced to accept a humiliating peace, not because Rome had beaten him, but because the Carthaginian state could no longer sustain the war, and who spent the rest of his life building in Spain the military and financial foundation for a war of revenge that he did not live to fight. His son Hannibal would fight it for him. The Barcid family represented something that constitutional republics always struggle to contain: a dynasty of genuine military genius, sustained by personal loyalty from an army that had been built over decades of successful campaigning, possessing financial resources from Spanish silver that gave them a degree of independence from the council's approval that the constitutional system had not been designed to manage. Aristotle had praised Carthage for its balance. The Barcids were what happened when the scales tilted, not through corruption or malice, but through the sheer overwhelming weight of talent and circumstance pressing down on one side. The republic that Aristotle admired survived them, but only barely, and not for long. What Rome eventually destroyed was not a monarchy, not a tyranny, not the primitive theocratic state that Roman propaganda required it to be. It was a republic with elected magistrates, a deliberative senate, a popular assembly, and an independent judicial body capable of holding generals accountable for their failures. It was, in other words, something uncomfortably close to what Rome believed itself to be. That resemblance may be the most unsettling fact in the entire history of the Punic Wars. And it is almost certainly part of the reason Rome worked so hard to ensure that Carthage would not be remembered on its own terms. It began, as so many catastrophic conflicts begin, with something almost embarrassingly small. A group of Italian mercenaries called the Mamertines, soldiers from the Campanian region of southern Italy, who had been hired by the city of Syracuse, and then, when their contract ended, had seized the Sicilian city of Messana for themselves, rather than go home, found themselves caught between two powers, neither of which they had initially wanted to involve. Syracuse, the great Greek city that dominated much of eastern Sicily, wanted them removed. The Mamertines appealed for help in two directions simultaneously: to Carthage and to Rome, with the particular desperation of people who understand that they are about to be crushed and will accept rescue from any quarter. Carthage responded first, stationing a garrison in Messana. Then Rome responded, sending an army across the narrow strait of water between the Italian peninsula and Sicily. And in the moment that Roman soldiers set foot on Sicilian soil, two civilizations that had coexisted under formal treaty for over 2 centuries found themselves, almost without intending it, in direct military confrontation for the first time. The year was 264 before the Common Era. Neither side fully understood yet what it had started. The conflict that would eventually consume both of them across 3 separate wars and more than a century of accumulated violence and grief began not with a grand strategic vision, but with a band of mercenary squatters on a Sicilian hilltop, appealing to whoever would listen. Sicily was not simply a convenient battlefield. It was the most fought-over island in the ancient Mediterranean, a place whose extraordinary agricultural fertility, whose strategic position at the crossroads of east-west and north-south sea routes, and whose existing population of Greek, Phoenician, and indigenous Sicilian communities had made it a zone of contested influence for centuries before Rome and Carthage arrived to add their weight to the competition. Carthage had held the western portion of the island for generations. The legacy of the Phoenician colonial network that had established trading settlements there centuries before the Punic Wars began. The Greek city of Syracuse held much of the east under its own sphere of influence. The island was, in other words, already divided along lines that reflected the prior history of Mediterranean power competition. And what the First Punic War did was introduce a new contestant into an existing game whose rules were already complicated. What Rome brought to that game was something Carthage had not anticipated and could not immediately counter: an absolute refusal to accept the logic of naval inferiority. Carthage had been the dominant maritime power in the Western Mediterranean for centuries. Its admirals were professionals who had spent their careers learning the currents and the winds and the tactical geometry of sea combat. Its warships were among the finest in the ancient world, crewed by experienced oarsmen whose coordination had been developed through years of active service. Rome had no significant naval tradition when the war began. Roman power had been built on land, on the extraordinary discipline and tactical flexibility of the legionary infantry system, and the sea was genuinely foreign territory for the Roman military imagination. The solution Rome found to this problem was characteristic of everything that made Rome, in the long run, impossible to permanently defeat. They found a captured Carthaginian warship, studied it with the systematic attention of engineers rather than the reverence of students, used it as the template for a new fleet that they proceeded to build with remarkable speed, and then invented a technological adaptation that turned their greatest weakness into a tactical advantage. The corvus was a boarding ramp fitted with a heavy iron spike at its end, mounted on a rotating pole on the deck of a Roman warship, capable of being dropped onto the deck of an enemy vessel and driven into the wood by its own weight, locking the two ships together. The invention was elegant in the way that the best military innovations are elegant. It did not try to make Rome something it was not. It instead changed the nature of the contest to favor what Rome already was. Carthaginian naval tactics depended on speed and maneuverability, on the ability to ram enemy ships with the bronze-tipped prow, or to shear off their oar banks with a fast angled pass, disabling them before infantry engagement could occur. The corvus made these tactics irrelevant. Once the spike was driven into a Carthaginian deck, the two ships were locked together, and the contest became a land battle fought on water, which meant legionary infantry against Carthaginian sailors. And that was a contest with a predictable outcome. The Romans won a series of significant naval engagements using this system, demonstrating to a stunned Carthaginian naval establishment that the maritime dominance they had held for centuries was not an immutable fact of the world, but a contingent advantage that could be stripped away by an enemy willing to think differently about the problem. The war lasted 23 years, grinding through its middle decades into a brutal attritional conflict fought across Sicilian territory, Sicilian waters, and at one disastrous point, the North African coast itself, where a Roman expeditionary force under the consul Regulus was defeated and Regulus himself captured, eventually, in 241 before the Common Era. A Roman fleet defeated the last Carthaginian naval force in the waters off the Aegates Islands, and Carthage, exhausted and financially drained, accepted terms. Sicily was surrendered. A massive indemnity was imposed. Hamilcar Barca, the Carthaginian general who had spent years holding the Sicilian interior against Roman pressure without ever being defeated in a set-piece engagement, boarded his ships and sailed home, unbeaten in the field, his army intact, carrying in his chest a cold and specific understanding of what had happened and what it meant. Rome had not out-generaled Carthage. Rome had out-endured it. And an enemy that wins by outlasting you rather than outthinking you is, in certain ways, the most dangerous kind, because there is no tactical solution to sheer, implacable persistence. Hamilcar understood this. He spent the remaining years of his life in Spain, building something designed to answer it. He brought his young son with him to watch the lesson of the First Punic War, the lesson that Carthage paid for in silver and territory, and the long humiliation of a forced peace, was not that Rome was stronger, it was that Rome was willing to rebuild, to absorb losses that would have ended any other state's appetite for conflict, and to keep coming. That lesson would take another generation to fully answer. Hamilcar's son would attempt the answer. And, for 15 years, watching Roman armies dissolve and reform like water, finding new channels after a flood, even he would discover that some lessons cannot be unlearned, no matter how brilliantly you teach them. Hamilcar Barca arrived on the Iberian Peninsula in 237 before the Common Era with an army, a mission, and a son who was 9 years old. The story that the ancient sources preserve about that departure has the quality of myth, but like the oxhide story of Alyssa, it carries a psychological truth that outlasts whatever literal accuracy it may or may not possess. The young Hannibal, watching his father prepare the army for the crossing to Spain, reportedly begged to be taken along. Hamilcar, according to the account, asked his son whether he understood what he was asking. The boy said that he did. Hamilcar then brought him to the altar where the pre-departure sacrifice was being made, and asked him to swear, with his hand on the offering, that he would never be a friend to Rome. The boy swore. Whether the scene happened precisely as described is impossible to know. What is not impossible to know is the emotional reality it encodes. A man who had been forced to surrender an undefeated army because his civilization could not sustain the financial cost of a war Rome had chosen to outlast rather than outfight, taking his eldest son to Spain to begin building the instrument of reversal, and wanting the boy to understand, at the level of the bones, what they were doing and why. Hannibal grew up in Spain. He learned war there, in the systematic way that only continuous active campaigning can teach it. Under his father, and then under his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal, who took command after Hamilcar died in battle in 228. By the time Hannibal himself assumed command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain in 221 before the Common Era, at the age of 26, he had spent more than half his life in the field. What Hamilcar had begun and Hasdrubal had expanded in Spain was not simply a military expedition, but the construction of a second Carthaginian empire. A territorial domain in the Iberian Peninsula that possessed everything the North African city needed for a sustained war against Rome, and that the peace terms of 241 had stripped away from the original commercial network. The silver mines of southern Spain, concentrated around the region of what is now Cartagena, the city that Hasdrubal founded and named Carthago Nova, New Carthage, in deliberate echo of the African mother city, were the financial engine of the entire enterprise. Ancient sources suggest that at their peak, the mines employed a workforce of tens of thousands, producing silver in quantities that generated revenues sufficient to fund a large professional army indefinitely without requiring approval or subsidy from the Carthaginian Council back in North Africa. This financial autonomy was not incidental to the Barcid project. It was central to it. An army funded from Spanish silver was an army that answered to its general, not to the merchant aristocracy sitting in council chambers across the Mediterranean. Hamilcar had understood that the constitutional machinery of the Carthaginian Republic, the Council of Elders with its cautious commercial calculation, the Board of 104 with its appetite for prosecuting unsuccessful commanders, was as much an obstacle to the kind of bold, sustained military strategy he envisioned as Rome itself was. Spanish silver solved that problem by removing the financial dependency that gave the council its leverage. What Hamilcar built, and what Hannibal inherited, was an army that was loyal to the Barcid name rather than to the Carthaginian state as an abstract institution. And that loyalty was the product not of coercion, but of years of demonstrated competence. Consistent victory, reliable pay, and the particular personal magnetism that the ancient sources unanimously attribute to all three of the major Barcid commanders, but most powerfully to Hannibal himself. The army that Hannibal led out of Spain in the spring of 218 before the Common Era was one of the most remarkable military instruments in the ancient world. And its remarkableness lay not in its size, which was substantial but not exceptional, but in its composition and its cohesion. Numidian cavalry from North Africa, fast, maneuverable, capable of sustained operations across difficult terrain and organized in tactical units whose flexibility would prove decisive in engagement after engagement, formed the most mobile element of the force. Celtic and Iberian infantry from Spain and Gaul provided the bulk of the heavy infantry. Fighters of ferocious personal courage, whose individual battlefield aggression complemented the disciplined tactical structures within which Hannibal deployed them. Libyan heavy infantry, trained and equipped in deliberate adaptation of the Roman legionary model, provided a corps of steady, experienced soldiers capable of holding difficult positions under sustained pressure. Balearic slingers provided ranged capability. And war elephants, those extraordinary animals whose psychological effect on enemies who had never encountered them was as significant as their physical impact on formations, accompanied the force in numbers that the crossing ahead would drastically reduce. What held this diverse force together across different languages, different fighting traditions, different cultural backgrounds, and different reasons for being in that army at all, was Hannibal. The ancient sources are consistent on this point across hostile and sympathetic accounts alike. Soldiers followed Hannibal not because they had to, but because they believed in him, because he had earned their trust through years of sharing their conditions, knowing their names, demonstrating tactical genius that kept them alive and victorious, and paying them reliably from the silver revenues of the Spanish mines. When the army reached the Alps in the late autumn of 218, facing the mountain crossing that would cost them perhaps a third of their strength to cold and starvation and rockslides, and the determined resistance of mountain tribes who saw a foreign army moving through their passes as an invitation for profitable violence, they crossed because Hannibal asked them to. The soldiers who emerged on the Italian side of the mountains in the early winter, gaunt and frost-damaged and reduced in number, had been transformed by what they had survived into something harder and more cohesive than the army that had entered the passes weeks before. They looked down from the final ridge at the plains of northern Italy spreading south toward the horizon. And somewhere in that exhausted, frozen, diminished force, the understanding settled that they had done what everyone had said could not be done. Rome was ahead of them, unwarned and unprepared for an enemy arriving from a direction its strategic imagination had not considered. The mountains were behind them, and Hannibal, standing at the head of the column, was already thinking about what came next. The summer of 216, before the Common Era, was the third consecutive summer in which a Carthaginian army had operated on Italian soil, and Rome was running out of the kind of patience that looks like strategy. The first 2 years had already been catastrophic by any reasonable measure of military catastrophe. At the Trebia River, in the December of 218, Hannibal had lured a Roman army across a freezing river in the early morning, half-fed and numb with cold, into a prepared ambush that destroyed the better part of 3 Roman legions. At Lake Trasimene, in the spring of 217. He had concealed his entire army in the fog along a hillside above a narrow lakeshore road and waited for a Roman force of perhaps 30,000 men to march into the corridor below him before closing both ends simultaneously, trapping the Romans between the water and the hills in a killing ground from which there was no exit and no formation, and no possibility of the disciplined tactical response that Roman infantry training was designed to produce. The consul commanding that army, Gaius Flaminius, died in the fighting. 15,000 Romans died with him, and most of the rest were captured. 2 consecutive defeats of this magnitude should have produced a Roman willingness to negotiate. What they produced instead was the appointment of a dictator. Quintus Fabius, Maximus, 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 who implemented a strategy of deliberate avoidance, shadowing Hannibal's army through the Italian countryside without committing to pitched battle, cutting off foraging parties, harassing supply lines, attempting to wear down the Carthaginian force through attrition rather than engagement. The Romans, who had to watch Hannibal's army burn and plunder the Italian countryside, while Fabius declined to intervene, gave their dictator a nickname that was not intended as a compliment: Cunctator, the delayer. It was an insult that history would eventually rehabilitate into a term of strategic respect. But in the summer of 216, it reflected a Roman public that had absorbed 2 catastrophic defeats and wanted blood, not patience. What Rome decided to do instead of patience was to assemble the largest army it had ever placed on a single battlefield and force a decisive engagement. The force that the 2 Roman consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro, led to the flat agricultural plain near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy, numbered somewhere in the range of 70 to 80,000 infantry and cavalry. An army so large that the Roman strategic thinking behind it was almost childishly straightforward. Put enough men on the field, and even Hannibal cannot maneuver around them. They placed their infantry in the center, in a formation deeper than normal Roman practice, compressing the attacking mass to give it more forward momentum, intending to drive straight through the Carthaginian center by sheer weight of numbers. Hannibal looked at what the Romans were doing and saw, with the particular clarity of a military mind that thinks in 3 dimensions when its opponents are thinking in 2, exactly what it meant. He placed his weakest infantry, Celtic and Iberian soldiers, in the center of his own line, in a formation that bowed forward toward the Romans. Convex rather than straight, he placed his strongest infantry, the Libyan veterans equipped and trained in the Roman manner, on the wings of the center. Angled inward, he placed his cavalry on the flanks, with instructions that transformed what might have seemed like a defensive deployment into the most lethal offensive trap in the history of ancient warfare. The battle began with the Roman infantry pushing forward against the Carthaginian center, and the center did what Hannibal had designed it to do. It gave way, slowly, under the Roman pressure, the convex bow bending backward and then inward, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into a narrowing space. What the Romans inside that press could not see, because they were focused on the backs of the Carthaginian infantry retreating before them, was that the wings were folding around them. The Libyan infantry on both sides was pivoting inward. The Carthaginian cavalry had already destroyed the Roman horsemen on both flanks and was beginning its return to the battlefield. The Romans were not advancing into a retreating enemy. They were walking into a closing fist. What happened next was not a battle in any conventional sense of the engagement between 2 organized forces. It was an extinction event. The Roman army, somewhere between 60 and 70,000 men, packed so tightly by the inward pressure of the encirclement that the soldiers on the inside could barely raise their arms to use their weapons, was systematically killed over the course of an afternoon. Ancient sources place the Roman dead at somewhere between 47,000 and 70,000 men, killed in a single day, the greatest single-day loss in Roman history. A number that strains the imagination, even when you understand the tactical mechanics that produced it. The consul Aemilius Paulus died in the fighting. 80 Roman senators died at Cannae. A fact that communicates the scale of the catastrophe more vividly than the raw casualty figures. Because it means that the men who had marched to that field included not just common soldiers, but the governing class of the Roman Republic. Hannibal's cavalry commander, Maharbal, reportedly urged him to march on Rome immediately, telling him that within 5 days Hannibal could be dining on the Capitoline Hill. Hannibal declined, and Maharbal's response, that Hannibal knew how to win a victory, but not how to use one, became one of the most famous critical judgments in military history. Whether the exchange happened as reported is uncertain. But the strategic question it encodes is real. Hannibal was not trying to capture Rome. He did not have siege equipment, and the city was too large and too heavily fortified for his army to take by assault. His strategy was political, to demonstrate Roman military weakness so convincingly that the Italian alliance network would dissolve, depriving Rome of the manpower reservoir that allowed it to rebuild army after every defeat. And in the immediate aftermath of Cannae, the strategy seemed to be working. Several of Rome's southern Italian allies defected, including the important city of Capua. Hannibal had his Italian base. Rome, by every conventional military calculation, should have been finished. What Hannibal could not calculate, because it lay outside the parameters of any military model, was the specific and extraordinary quality of Roman stubbornness, a collective refusal to acknowledge that the logic of the situation required submission, a capacity for absorbing loss that had no precedent in the ancient world and that would spend the next 13 years slowly, agonizingly, grinding the most brilliant military campaign in history into a stalemate that felt, from inside the Carthaginian position, increasingly like a long and beautiful march toward defeat. There was a young Roman officer at Cannae who did not die. He was 17 or 18 years old, the son of a consul, and he survived the catastrophe on the plain near the Orpheus River by doing what the situation required: withdrawing, regrouping, keeping his head in conditions designed to produce panic. In the days immediately following the battle, when a group of surviving Roman officers gathered and began discussing the possibility of abandoning Italy entirely, of sailing to some foreign king and offering their swords in foreign service, because Rome was clearly finished, this young man drew his sword and told them that anyone who was contemplating abandoning Rome would deal with him first, personally, before they left the room. The speech, or something like it, apparently worked. The officers stayed. Rome did not abandon itself, and the young man who had held that room together in the wreckage of Cannae spent the next several years watching Hannibal operate in Italy with the particular quality of attention that transforms observation into understanding. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he was studying, not the way a student studies from a safe distance, taking notes on someone else's experience, but the way a soldier studies when the lessons are written in the deaths of people he knew, in the destruction of armies he had marched with, in the tactical geometry of defeats so comprehensive that they functioned as textbooks of military possibility. Hannibal had shown Rome things about warfare that Rome had not known before. Scipio was the Roman who understood that the correct response to being shown something new was not to find a defense against it, but to learn it well enough to use it yourself. In 210 before the Common Era, following a series of military disasters in Spain that had killed both Scipio's father and his uncle and left the Carthaginian forces under Hasdrubal Barca dominant across the peninsula, The Roman Senate gave command of the Spanish campaign to Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was 24 years old, and he had no prior independent command experience. The appointment was an act of institutional desperation, dressed in the clothing of bold strategic vision. And it worked in the way that desperate appointments sometimes do when the person appointed happens to be genuinely extraordinary. What Scipio brought to Spain was a combination of qualities that Hannibal himself possessed and that Rome's previous commanders in the peninsula had lacked almost entirely: tactical imagination, strategic boldness, an intelligence network that he cultivated with genuine care, and the ability to inspire in the soldiers under his command the kind of personal loyalty that transforms an army from a collection of armed men following orders into a force willing to attempt things that seem impossible because their commander has earned the right to ask. His first major operation in Spain demonstrated immediately that he had understood what Hannibal had been teaching. Carthago Nova, the great Carthaginian-based city on the Spanish coast, the hub of the entire Barcid enterprise in the peninsula, was considered effectively impregnable. A fortified city on a peninsula, surrounded on three sides by water, garrisoned by a substantial force, and central enough to the Carthaginian supply network that its loss would be strategically devastating. Scipio learned from local fishermen that the lagoon protecting one side of the city was shallow enough, at certain times of day, when the wind drove the water back, to be waded. He launched his assault on the harbour side with his main force, drawing the garrison's attention and defensive effort toward the seaward walls, and simultaneously sent a force of 500 men wading through the lagoon at low tide to scale the relatively undefended walls on the opposite side. Carthago Nova fell in a single day. Scipio was 24 years old and had just captured the most important Carthaginian installation in Spain by reading the water and the wind with the same attentiveness that Hannibal had always read terrain. The decision to carry the war to Africa, to cross the Mediterranean with a Roman army, land in Carthaginian home territory, and threaten the city itself, was the strategic masterstroke that ended the Second Punic War. And it required Scipio to fight the Roman Senate as hard as he fought the Carthaginians. There were senior senators who argued, with the conservative institutional caution that had sustained Rome through the worst years of Hannibal's Italian campaign, that the correct strategy was to keep pressing Hannibal in Italy rather than dispersing Roman military effort across the Mediterranean. Scipio understood something these men did not, or would not, acknowledge: that Hannibal in Italy, after 13 years without reinforcement and without the ability to replace losses, was a diminishing threat that could be managed rather than a crisis that required solution. The real strategic problem was Carthage itself, the city and the civilization that could produce another Hannibal, or support the one it had, as long as it remained intact and prosperous. Scipio landed in North Africa in 204 before the Common Era, allied himself with the Numidian prince Massinissa, whose cavalry would prove to be the decisive military factor in the campaign's culminating battle, and began systematically defeating the Carthaginian and allied forces in North Africa in engagements that brought the war progressively closer to Carthage itself. The city that had sent Hannibal to threaten Rome now found Rome threatening it, and recalled Hannibal from Italy for the first time in 15 years. He came home to a North Africa he had not seen since childhood, to fight for a city he had left as a boy, commanding an army that was formidable, but that lacked the one element his Italian force had possessed in abundance: the superb Numidian cavalry that Massinissa had taken to the Roman side. At Zama, in 202 before the Common Era, on a flat plain that gave neither commander the terrain advantages that both preferred, Hannibal and Scipio met in the battle that both sides understood would end the war. Hannibal's cavalry was swept from the field early. His infantry held for a time against the Roman legions with the desperate professionalism of veterans who understood exactly what was happening and fought on anyway. And then, Massinissa's Numidian horsemen returned from their pursuit of the routed Carthaginian cavalry and struck the Carthaginian infantry from behind in a double envelopment, the same encircling maneuver that Hannibal had used at Cannae to destroy a Roman army. Now executed against him by a commander who had studied Cannae carefully enough to understand not just what Hannibal had done, but why it worked, and how to replicate it against different opposition. Hannibal was defeated by a version of his own greatest creation, wielded by the one Roman general who had understood it deeply enough to use it. He went into exile rather than face the faction in Carthage that blamed him for the war, wandering through the courts of Eastern monarchs for years. A figure of extraordinary prestige and genuine military genius with nowhere left to deploy it. Until he took his own life to avoid capture by Roman agents, who had been hunting him across the eastern Mediterranean, with a persistence that itself communicated something about how deeply Rome feared him, even in defeat. The figs that Marcus Porcius Cato held up in the Roman Senate sometime in the early 150s before the Common Era were fresh. That was the point. He had brought them back from a diplomatic mission to Carthage, and he displayed them to his colleagues not as a curiosity, but as an argument. 3 days sailing from Rome. He told them, and this is what grows there. The implication was not about agriculture. It was about proximity, about the fact that a city Rome had defeated and humiliated and stripped of its fleet and its empire and its military autonomy, had used the intervening half-century to become, through the sheer disciplined application of agricultural science and commercial intelligence, wealthier than it had been before the war. The economic recovery of Carthage after Zama had been, by any honest assessment, extraordinary. The agricultural hinterland of the Tunisian coastal plain, managed according to the systematic techniques that Mago's 28-volume treatise had advocated and refined, was producing surpluses of grain and olive oil on a scale that made the province the most productive agricultural region in the Mediterranean world. Roman senators who visited returned with reports of a city more prosperous than it had appeared during the years of conflict. Reports that landed in the Senate chamber with the particular destabilizing effect of information that contradicts a comfortable assumption. The assumption had been that a defeated Carthage was a contained Carthage, that the peace terms of 201 had solved the problem permanently. Cato's figs suggested otherwise. And Cato himself was not a man who let suggestions rest. He reportedly ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of its ostensible subject. Grande distribution, road maintenance, judicial appointments, anything. With the same 7 Latin words, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He said it so often and so insistently that it became a kind of dark music in the background of Roman political life. A drumbeat of existential anxiety, dressed in the clothing of strategic necessity, the mechanism by which Rome manufactured its justification for the final war, was one of the most cynically deliberate exercises in pretextual aggression in the ancient world. And understanding it requires understanding the role of Massinissa, the Numidian king, whose long life he was still commanding his own army in battle at an age that ancient sources place above 80, had been spent in the systematic exploitation of his status as Rome's favoured African ally. The peace terms that ended the Second Punic War had given Massinissa the right to recover any territories that had anciently belonged to Numidia or to his ancestors, a provision so vague in its geographic scope that it functioned as an essentially unlimited license for territorial expansion at Carthaginian expense. For 50 years, Massinissa made a succession of territorial claims against Carthage, each backed by the implicit guarantee of Roman military support, each submitted to Roman arbitration that consistently found in the Numidian king's favour. each reducing further the agricultural hinterland that sustained Carthaginian prosperity. Carthage appealed to Roman legal process again and again, accepting judgments that stripped away land and revenue and strategic depth, because the alternative, military resistance without Roman permission, violated the peace terms of 201 and would give Rome the legal pretext for war that Rome was. With increasing transparency, looking for. By the early 150s, the encroachments had reached a point where the Carthaginian population, watching its territory shrink decade by decade, to the advantage of a neighbour acting with Roman protection, concluded that submission had not bought safety and would not buy it, that Massinissa would keep taking until there was nothing left to take, and that fighting back against his latest territorial claim was no worse a strategic choice than the slow strangulation that patience had been producing. In 150 before the Common Era, Carthage responded to a Numidian incursion with military force. Rome had its pretext. The Senate voted for war. The Third Punic War had begun. And Carthage, which had surrendered its weapons and its autonomy and its empire in the hope of being left alone to prosper in peace, was about to discover that prosperity itself had been the provocation. The siege that followed was not what Rome expected. The Roman commanders who arrived before Carthage in 149, anticipating a swift capitulation, found instead a city that had decided, with the particular clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose through resistance, to fight. The Carthaginians had already surrendered their hostages and their weapons, 300 children of noble families handed over as surety, and the entire city's arsenal of armaments. Thousands of suits of armor and hundreds of thousands of weapons, loaded onto Roman ships in an act of compliance, so complete it should have been sufficient to satisfy any reasonable demand. When the Romans revealed that their actual intention was the destruction of the city, regardless of compliance, that the Carthaginians were to abandon their coastal home and relocate inland away from the sea, a demand that was not a peace condition, but a death sentence for a maritime civilization, Carthage reversed course with a speed and determination that stunned the Roman forces outside its walls. The city converted its public buildings into armament workshops. Citizens with no military training were organized into production lines manufacturing weapons from whatever materials remained. Ancient sources describe women cutting their hair to provide the sinew and fiber needed for the tension mechanisms of catapults and bows. An image so specific and so viscerally human that it has stayed in the historical memory across 2,000 years as a symbol of what a people will sacrifice when the alternative is annihilation. The generals who organized this improvised defense held a Roman army, equipped with bitter irony, partly with the weapons that Carthage itself had surrendered, at bay for 3 years. The Roman commanders, who had expected a quick campaign, found themselves conducting a protracted siege against walls, defended by people who had decided that death inside their city was preferable to survival outside it. The officer who finally broke the deadlock was Scipio Aemilianus, adopted grandson of Scipio Africanus, elected consul and given command of the African campaign in 147, precisely because the earlier commanders had failed to make progress. He blockaded the harbour, sealed the city's land approaches with systematic siege engineering, and began the methodical reduction of Carthage's defences with the professional competence of a man who understood that the city would not surrender and adjusted his approach accordingly. When his forces finally breached the walls in 146, what followed was 6 days of street fighting through the densely built urban landscape of a city that had housed hundreds of thousands of people and was now defended by its last survivors with the weapons they had made from their own hair. The fighting moved building by building, floor by floor, the Roman soldiers clearing each level before advancing to the next, while Carthaginian defenders used rooftops and the bridges between buildings as positions from which to slow an advance they could not stop. When the fighting reached the citadel of Bursa, the last 50,000 survivors surrendered and were enslaved. The buildings burned for 17 days. The last commander of Carthage, a man named Hasdrubal, slipped away from his own soldiers in the final hours and went personally to prostrate himself before Scipio Aemilianus, begging for mercy. His wife, watching from the citadel where the remaining defenders had gathered, responded with a speech the ancient sources preserve as one of the most devastating expressions of contempt in all of ancient history. She cursed her husband for his cowardice, declared her own determination to die rather than submit, killed her children rather than deliver them into Roman slavery, and threw herself into the flames of the burning temple of Eshmun. Whether every detail of this account is historically precise is uncertain. What is certain is that the ancient world recognized it as true to the character of a people who had fought for their city, to the last breath of the last person willing to draw one. Scipio Aemilianus, watching the fire from his command position, wept and quoted Homer, lines about the fall of Troy, about how even the greatest cities eventually become ash and memory. His companion, Polybius, asked him what he meant. Scipio said he was thinking about Rome, that someday someone might stand over Rome's ruins and say the same words. The libraries of Carthage burned with the city. 7 centuries of illiterate civilizations accumulated writing. Its histories, its religious texts, its commercial records, its literature, its scientific knowledge, was destroyed so completely that almost nothing survived except the agricultural treatise that the Romans preserved, because they found it useful. The Punic language continued to be spoken in North Africa for centuries. Noted by St. Augustine, still living in rural communities 500 years after the city's destruction. The Tifinagh script, used by the Tuareg people of the Sahara, to this day may carry in its letter forms the distant inheritance of Phoenician and Punic writing systems. Hannibal's ghost walks through the curriculum of every military academy on Earth. His encirclement at Cannae, still taught as the theoretical ideal of battlefield annihilation. The outlines of the Cothan harbours are still visible from the air above the Tunisian coast. 2,000 years of sedimentation, having filled, but not entirely erased, the engineering of a civilization that once controlled the throat of the Mediterranean world. Rome salted nothing. The story that the ground was salted to prevent anything from growing is almost certainly a later invention, appearing nowhere in the ancient sources that describe the destruction in detail. But the fact that the story was invented, that someone felt the need to imagine Rome going to that extreme, says something true about the anxiety that drove the destruction in the first place. The need to make absolutely certain, to eliminate not just the city, but the possibility of the city, to kill not just Carthage, but the idea that Carthage could ever rise again. Some cities are destroyed because they are defeated. Carthage was destroyed because even in defeat it refused. Through the simple fact of its continuing existence and prosperity, to stop being what it was. That is the most Carthaginian thing about its ending. And it is, in the end, also the reason it has never been entirely forgotten.